Configuration XML. This is a great lesson because this is where we do what it is we do in Magento and register our module. We're also going to look at how Magento interacts with the configuration and look at different store scopes. Okay? So, Magento configuration is a bunch of XML files that are merged together during app initialization in one tree. That's a true statement. When the application is initialized, if we're not operating off of some cached compiled configuration, then several things happen in Magento. First, we look in app etc modules. Well, actually, not first, but outside of some core configuration files like your local.xml under app etc. There's also config.xml and enterprise.xml. But in app etc modules, we have what are called either module registration files or module activation files. What these files do is, the code that actually looks in here, it's just simply globbing etc modules and looking for anything that matches star.xml. So any XML file under modules will be read. So it's not enough to like rename your module file to something else, because if it ends in .xml, it will be read. So this is not the module configuration file, though. This is just the activation file. What these look like internally is a config node. So the root node, so every XML document has to have a root node. And for configuration files, it's config. Inside there, we'll have a modules node. And inside modules, we have our namespace and module name. That is required. And it has to match the file system path. Okay? So there's some other things in here, vital pieces of information. The active flag, which basically says to the application, this module is active. Go forth and find its configuration in the module folder. And then the code pool, which simply specifies where under app code the module can be found. Okay? And then here we actually have set up some dependencies. And you'll see the syntax for setting up dependencies is to use a similar node like is specified in modules. So again, Saran, and this is actually maybe one of those capitalization things that you were wondering about. What goes here is used in conjunction with the code pool to find the module. That's how the system knows where to look for your module. So for this setting right here, I would say, okay, well, this is in core. So app code core, the system knows here, app code core / enterprise / banner. So underscores in here will be converted to a slash. So this would translate to, again, app code core, and then enterprise banner. And then in here, I would find my etc folder, and inside there, config.xml. Okay? So that is how Magento finds out about your module. Any questions? All right. So that's step one. So now we will start to look at the configuration itself. So in general, now keep in mind though that configuration files are all merged together into one structure from active modules. So all of those XML files in app etc modules, and then based on what we found here, if for enterprise banner the active flag was set to true, so then the system is going to go and look for Etsy folder inside of the modules directory, and then, or each modules directory, and then inside there, look for config XML. And again, config XML inside there will also have a root node of config, and then basically anything else it wants to have inside. Unfortunately, there's no document definition for these files. Excuse me. They're only used. They're only evaluated by a PHP class. I mean, so basically, the machinery of that class looks at different XPaths to find certain bits of information. So that's why the structure matters. So, one thing to note here, these files are loaded strictly in alphabetical order, unless you declare a module dependency, in which case some other module's configuration will be loaded. So in this case, admin HTML, catalog rule, sales rule, enterprise CMS, enterprise customer segment would all be loaded before, configuration files would all be loaded before this one. That's one of the effects of setting up a dependency. So, global node defines, obviously, really important stuff. And this is why local.xml is read first, and also read last, by the way, app-etsy local. But that's where, when you go, that's actually the one time that Magento writes information to a configuration file. Other than that, it will not touch it, any configuration file. So when you're running through how many people have actually installed Magento using the Magento installer? So the first time you download the file pack, if certain conditions aren't met, Magento considers itself uninstalled and runs through an install sequence. And one of the things that you specify in there are database information, including like table prefix, etc. And that information is written into local app-etsy local.xml. Okay? So, let's see. What else do we have here? Okay, the connection types, so read and write. These are, you can find these also if you look in app-etsy config.xml. We set up different connection types, database adapters, and then also some of the core module class names are configured. They're actually, I think they're there, but they're not necessary. Anyway, a little background. So, all right, directory structure. So the default node will give us, again, this is used for configuration in all store scopes. So it's possible in a configuration file to specify information scoped to different stores. And the default node, whatever's in the default node, will actually be sort of when the configuration is generated, will be considered and applied to each store node that's being created. I know I'm kind of giving you a lot of ethereal stuff that's hard to hold on to, but just bear with me just a second because we'll get our hands on this pretty soon. So really, what I tend to do when I see a config file is I look for the nodes directly under or directly inside config, because those are the significant areas here. So we have our different configuration areas. So like front end, global, admin, and admin HTML are nodes that you'll see directly under config, and those refer to those are configuration areas and are different from the design areas that I was discussing earlier. Let's see. So in the different area nodes, we might define, so for front end or admin, we might set up routers, and these are the things that actually handle these requests that come in and determine whether or not, determine basically how we're going to match that request and dispatch controllers. And of course, we get very tactile with that here in a day or so. We also can specify our layout XML files, which is what we were talking about earlier. So inside front end, we might have updates, and I think we actually have an example of doing that a little later on. And we also declare our observers. So that's our event-driven architecture. And again, that's done in the different area scopes. So here or here. And then that takes us to something like catalog, which is just basically a namespace node up to you. If you have your own module, you could put your module here. and have some basic configuration there. So that would be actually a great way to have some sort of default configuration for your module. So when you hand out your module, you can specify something here, and then you would have a class that just uses Magento's configuration parsing ability to retrieve those values. Or, when those values are retrieved, perhaps you have some defaults set up here for your module, but then you also have an administrative piece that does configuration in the database, in the system config screen. So once the user has set up something there, well, then that would be the configuration that would be used. But this is a great way to hand out a base install, a base install setting. Any questions so far? Here's where we start to get practical. So if we have a store object, we can just simply say, hey, get config, and specify an XPath. And we'll get a configuration value, whether it's been specified at the store level or whether it comes to us from the default scope. If we want to get part of a config, well, we can specify a path here, and we can do this anywhere in the application using this static method here. And we can pass in a path, and if we want, we can specify a store code or ID. All right? Now, if we want to check false, if we want to check a flag in the configuration, so that's the problem, certainly in PHP, but obviously if you have a string will always evaluate to true. So there's this function here, get store config flag, and it looks to see if the node is defined and if the node is true, or actually if it's not false. Might have to look that one up, actually. It might just be that it's not false. The default is false. So if you don't define the node that you reference here using XPath, and you're familiar with XPath, right? I mean, it's just it actually would look not unlike this. Just instead of having these nested bracketed nodes, you end up with just node / node / node, and that'll refer to a value. And then down here, mage get config get node. This is where we can actually get the node itself, and that is effectively that's a very simple XML element object. So that gives us, and that ultimately extends from the PHP's simple XML. So that provides us with some basic functionality for reading into XML like DOM structures. Okay? Any questions so far? We're about to do a little exercise. All right? No one's asleep. You guys are doing well for after lunch. So over here we have website, store name, store view name. So this would be like store, website, store view. Well, the problem is in the code, what is a store in that screen in the middle there is the store group. You don't set configuration values against a store group. They're either in a website, you're actually really dealing in the store scope. Okay? That's just one of those unfortunate things. But just be aware of that. So that can help you as you look through the code and you're seeing, what is a store versus a store view. Stores are store views. Make sense? Yeah, just one of those things to know. Again, I'm just filling you up with all sorts of great things you can drop at cocktail parties and Magento meetups. You're going to say, well, I know exactly why they did that. Because that's how they did it. All right, well, now here at the end of Lesson 5, we can actually get into what we came here to do, and that is make a module. So I'm going to take you through the steps that Magento goes through to when Magento is discovering all the modules in the system. That's the same way I like to create a module. I think it's just a really good way to reinforce the order in which things are evaluated. So what you need to do under app code local is where we're going to be putting our module. But the very first stop that the system goes is right here. As far as creating our custom module, we need to create our module declaration file. And that's here in app etc modules. Now, if you remember, anything ending in .xml is going to end up here. So I strongly recommend if you want to
I left the module active once by accident for this because I just changed the first name, the first part of the file name. It doesn't work. This was when I was pretty new to Magento. So again, this is just a PHP glob. We'll look for star.xml, and we'll just evaluate all of these files here. And again, that's exactly why you don't want to have your entire module configuration in there. Okay? So just create a new XML file. And I like to use the convention of namespace underscore module name .xml. So let's see, what will we name this? Well, we'll call this our very first module. So we'll use a namespace of first and a module name of module. All right. Now, the structure of configuration files will always have a root node of config. And then for a module declaration file, we simply need a modules node. And then, now what happens here is important. One of the toughest things to do can be to find your way around the configuration and learn which parts matter and which parts don't. For your modules node under modules, you need to match this string here to the folder structure that you're going to have inside your code pool. So based on the namespace and module name that I've chosen, first underscore module, I can just simply put the same thing here. And now the interesting thing that happens is when Magento sees this node, sorry. The interesting thing that happens here is that when Magento sees this node, first module, we're actually going to look in the code pool that we set here if our module is active. So here's our active flag. And here is our code pool. Remember, code pool is one of the few nodes that's camel-cased. So you have to have a capital P in there. And we're going to use the local code pool. Now, what happens is Magento, the configuration, when we're spinning up, we're going to look in app code local, first module. So a first folder that contains a module folder. And in there, look for an Etsy folder and find our config XML. That's the process that Magento goes through to load your module configuration. So that's why this is one of those nodes that really does matter what you name it. You have to remember this, else the system, if I put this, intended for this to point to some other location, my module configuration would never be loaded. So, let me make a little note here. So you might make the same note yourself. So that's app code. Actually, I'll change this to be code pool. And then first module. All right, lovely. So we've now done the most important part of getting our module activated in the system. So the next step, of course, then, is to create this folder structure under local. So we simply just need a first module, and we can go ahead and make our Etsy folder because that's what we'll need to. That's where we'll need to store our config XML file. So in here, we'll create another XML document called config, and it must be named config. And in here, we can start to do the things that we need to do. So right now, we have an active module in the system, or at least as soon as we refresh the configuration cache. So what we need to do first is specify an option in our config file. Well, if you recall, there was a default node. And in our default node, we can simply declare some XPath. So I will do just that. Some random XPath. All right, and here's a value. Oops. All right. So that's it. We've declared an option. This node will actually be copied under the stores node, so config stores, under each store's individual node. So if we have a store code of English or something, you would see, at the same level, you would see stores, and then an English node, and then under there, we'd have some random XPath. That's effectively what's happening in the configuration in that big DOM structure. So how do we get access to this? Well, some interesting things that we need to do. So what we'll have to do is go, according to our instructions here, we need to go into the CMS index controller, which incidentally, based on your configuration, is going to be used to serve the home page. So what I'd like to do is open up AppCode Core, Mage, CMS, little c controllers, index controller. And here is our index action. We'll explain more about routing later on, or routing, I guess, depending on your corner of the world. But suffice it to say that internally, Magento is going to map a request for that doesn't have any sort of parameters after the URL, or after just the site, the domain name, to this location. So I can prove that to you, of course. Fire up my browser of choice. Whoops. 127001, and then Mage. Uh-oh. Helps if I turn on my web server. So, is anyone having any problems finding it? So you see where I went, right, was, once again, sorry, I moved through that a little bit quickly, but yeah, so Mage, CMS, controllers, index controller, and we're in the index action. So now I should have a home page. There we go, it's coming. So with our home page here, if I were to, so the basis of the root of my site is at, localhost mage training dev, my local host IP anyway. And if I go and just specify CMS/index/index, well, I get the same thing. Voila. All right, so that's CMS module, index controller, index action. Incidentally, of course, because index is always assumed, I can just go to CMS. If you want to configure this, it's in the admin under System Configuration and Web, I believe, for the default pages. Or somewhere thereabouts. All right, so how do we make something happen here? Well, quite simply, let's just check that we're in the right place. I'll do a die, and hello world. And let's see. Now, if you have Enterprise Edition installed and you didn't see a difference, you're either in the wrong Magento instance or you have full page caching enabled. So if you're still seeing the home page and it rendered very quickly, you probably have full page caching enabled. Just go to system configuration or system cache management and disable full page caching. All right, so now that we've proved that this works, we can start to do what the task has asked us to do. So I'm going to leave this die statement in. It's a bit of a silly example. I mean, this is certainly not a customization you would ever do. Really, the goal of doing this right here is to get you guys familiar with the idea that the CMS system is used to serve basically the page with no routing information as far as the system goes. All right. So we need to display our option. Well, we can do that any number of ways. So simplest way, perhaps, is mage. Let's see. Mage get config. I'm sorry. Let's do mage get store config. And then we'll specify, we'll do the config in just a second. And we'll specify just the XPath that we have here. So sum random XPath. So sum / random / XPath. Oh, I have to save my file. So here we have a value. This is exactly what we intended to see. Again, this is not a very practical example, but just an important thing to show you this how Magento accesses its configuration and how you can scope the configuration based on store. This is not a very typical usage. If I want to, for example, if I want to specify a different value based on a different store, well, I need to know, you may need to create new store views, or you may need to find out what your store view code is. So you just log into your admin. Just log into your admin, and then you'll see under Manage Stores, under the System tab, you can see that I have 3 different store views. I'm interested in the French store view, because that will show me the code, which happens, of course, to be French. Literally the string French. So if I want to specify something different for the French store in the admin, or I'm sorry, in the config XML, I need a stores node. And in there, I'll need a node with the actual store code, French. And then I can just copy in that same XPath. And I will change this. If I knew French, I would write this in French, but I don't. So this will just serve to show you that it is, in fact, working. Now, this, again, isn't very practical, because if the store code were ever changed, then this configuration would no longer work. But this is just a demonstration of what's actually happening in the DOM structure with the default node. Because for each of those stores, aka store views, stores in Magento, this stores node exists, and anything that's specified under default, it's copied basically under each stores node. So if we were to look at the configuration, the DOM structure, we would see stores French, stores German, and stores default. And the reason it would be default is because in this install, the English store actually has a store code of default. So What we're going to do, though, is we're going to override what is automatically put there based on the default node. So I just need to switch store views, and I can do that just by going to 404 page. And now I am, let's see, I will choose the French store. And if I go back, I should see something different. Voila. Here is a French value. So that's how that works. Now, our next task, were there any questions on that? No? Okay, so everyone's got this working. Yeah? Okay. Very good. So now we have to, let's see, set different values for different stores to your option, get all values of your option in the controller. Now, the other thing really to show you is another command here. And let's see. Let's do this. Let's use get config. And get node. Now, I'll pass the same string in here, some random XPath, but I don't want to echo it here. I'm going to var dump. Let's see. So Mage get config, that gets the config object. That's Mage core model config. And then we run just get node. Now the interesting thing here, and Magento uses this all over the place, but what this does is this gives us an object. So if we go back to our page here, I don't have that XPath. Oh, why don't I have that XPath? Because when you're using get node, you actually have to specify the full XPath, basically starting inside that config root node. So default. Once I have that default in there, I get Mage core model config element. So basically the config object contains these elements. It gets you this piece of the config DOM structure, and it's always the return value of this is always an object, so that you can you can cast this to a string if you want, or do something else with the value. You could. The point is you can access the configuration from there below, and that's actually what the config model does all the time. So, if there are no questions, that is the end of the lesson.